So hi everyone and welcome to our weekly AATRN seminar. The speaker today is Killian Meehan, and he's going to tell us about Topological Node2vec, graph embeddings with persistent homology.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the time accommodation, especially anybody here from the Americas. Thank you very much. I appreciate your sleep sacrifice. I wish you all the energy you need to get through a day on imperfect amounts of sleep. Yeah, my name's Killian. I'm currently at Kyoto University. And this work that I'll be talking to you about, we were able to get this published just a couple months ago. This has all been done with the help of help is an understatement, of course. This has all been done as a joint work with the four people here, Yasuaki Hiroka, Yusuke Imoto, Teo Lacombe, and Toshiaki Yachimura. Once again, please interrupt me anytime if you have any questions. This is a bit of a, there's a number of topics in here, and if any of them throw you off, I would love a chance to explain a little bit more. Okay. Here is the first chapter of Alice in Wonderland. Bunch of words. The words are in a row. The words are arranged linearly. They have relationships like which words are next to each other. They have structure like grammar. Pronouns are structurally interchangeable. Articles, a and the, adverbs, all that. This is an example of data that is, I want to call this, well, I don't know, relational data. There's not exactly anything absolute. You don't pick out one of these words and say, yes, this is everything I need to know about this word. All the information is in how these words relate to each other. That's all well and good. Maybe you want to do something like assign some absolute properties to these words because the relative stuff is driving you nuts. Maybe you would like to assign a vector to each of these words or a point in space. So you can do that. Surprise. You can, well, all right, I'm going to get to the details in just a moment. Here's a very, very elementary example I've run using some code that assigns a two-dimensional vector to every word in the first chapter of Alice in Wonderland. Now, 2 dimensions is a bit ambitious for respecting all this structure and relationships, as you can see, because it's just one big word soup in the middle. But even then, with this very naive, let me just do it and see if I can put it in a presentation example, there's actually some shockingly good stuff here. Roast pineapple is a fun example. Those 2 words only appear one time each in the text, and they appear together. So they're very related to each other and very loosely related to anything else. However, as you kind of move towards this big soup in the middle, you'll encounter almost exclusively other food words. Right? We have custard, we have cherry tart, milk, turkey, tea time, hope. I don't know how hope got in there, but whatever. So basically, you can already see that in a very naive and ambitious 2-dimensional presentation of all these intricate relationships, we already have something kind of interesting happening. This is an application of the code or the neural network known as Word2vec. This is Baby's very first natural language processing example, but it's illustrative. So here's, for example, I don't have to do this in 2 dimensions. I can embed all these words into 8 dimensions. And I've done that here and just colored the vectors a little bit for a fun discussion. You notice that all the ing words and the ed words have like a really, so all these words are projected into a -1 to 1 hypercube. So there's very high values in the 7th vector for all words of these 2 types. The 7th coordinate of the vector is not special. It does not mean anything. There is no absolute, it's trying to simultaneously balance all this information, right? Maybe this part of my talk is already outdated with the massive surge of ChatGPT and people now starting to understand how this sort of information can be collected and parsed and represented, but all the same, here it is. To explain this structure to you just a little bit, the way this is done is that every word is described entirely by its immediate neighbors, or maybe not quite immediate. Maybe you can go like 2 words to either side. That is the only information that's used to generate this kind of embedding. So speaking of embeddings, and the machine learning processes that go on here, let me talk about what's being done here by describing to you incredibly briefly what a gradient descent machine learning framework is. You have some variables, you have some training data, you have some function that compares your current variables to your training data and figures out how much they disagree. And then you say, okay, well, now I'm going to take the derivative of this disagreement or this loss function with respect to all my variables, and then I'm going to follow the negative slope, and I'm going to do it again. In the example I just described, the sum variables are a proposed Euclidean embedding for the words. It starts off completely random. You just pick a random point in that hypercube for each word. The training data is the reference, the known information about the words from the text. You know what this word's neighbors are. And this word can appear multiple times and have multiple sets of neighbors. That's all taken care of. So this neighborhood notion exists in my Euclidean embedding as well. I can talk about proximities. I can talk about which points are close, which words are nearby, far apart. So I simply compare those. For anyone interested, it's cross entropy regarding both of these vectors as probability vectors. And you say, oh, okay, the correct neighborhood information and my current neighborhood information disagree. Let's fix that. And this little eta here is because you don't want to fix it all at once. There's a lot of nuance going on here. So you fix it a little bit, a couple thousand times, and you're done. That's it. That's a gradient descent network. You can program one by yourself. The example I made above without using any packages or anything took like 2 or 3 lines of code, and I am not an efficient programmer. It's a very simple structure that has a lot of, I don't know, sometimes a ridiculous amount of power. Okay, why was I talking about Alice in Wonderland and words and all this stuff? And that's because you can maybe see a little bit of a naming convention kind of thing going on here. After word2vec came this deep walk idea and then node2vec. I won't get into the exact details of how these differ, but basically they're like, hey, well, why can't we do this with any relative or relational data? It might not be words with neighbors, but I have graphs, I have nodes and edges. So I have this exact same idea of proximity, which is honestly all I need. Now, something kind of cool came out of this, which is the most naive version of this is you take a given node and you just say, this guy's neighborhood is just everything it's connected to. There's maybe 2 problems with that. One, if you have more sensitive data like a weighted graph, you have to be a little more careful. You probably want some cutoff. You only want to include nodes that have, a strong connection. But also, even in the case of non-weighted data, this just performed quite poorly in a lot of these early examples. And what came out of this was the proposition that you take random walks to generate the neighborhood information. So for each node, you have to define the neighborhood, and to define the neighborhood, you prescribe a number of walks starting from that node and the length of the walks starting from that node. That's the deep walk formula. The node2vec formula adds a little bit where you can specify these parameters which encourage your walk to move strictly further away or to kind of stay in the local area. It's very nice. It's very flexible. If you create a large enough number and length of your random walks, you do a really good job sampling all the nuance of the graph. And if you want to go absolutely crazy, you can re-sample these random walks at every step of your gradient descent network and just get perfect coverage of the intricate relationships. Okay, here's the same thing. Our sum variables are proposed Euclidean embeddings of the nodes. The node information now that we use for training is gained by random walks. We use the exact same loss function to compare the 2 neighborhoods and decide how different they are. We update, we continue, that's that. Now we bounce back to this slide, just you can do wacky things with your random walks. Okay, well, let's suddenly introduce something. Could we do this with hypergraphs? Absolutely. Absolutely, for two reasons. Like one, you could just, fine, you can just take random walks on hypergraphs too. There's nothing stopping you. And actually, there's a result that random walks on hypergraphs, you might as well not really bother, because in basically all cases that you care about, you can just take random walks on the clique expansion of the hypergraph. I don't know if that's a common term, but all I mean by that is take all sub edges contained within a hyper edge and just make a graph out of all of those. So whatever, we've got a lot of variety here. It's pretty good. What's going on? What's going on is a little bit of a discussion on motivation and biology. Trust me, you're in good hands, by which I mean you're in very poor hands, because I'm not a biologist, and that means I'm not going to get into the biology that none of us will understand, excepting, of course, the presence of any actual biologist in the audience, in which case, oh dear. I'm so sorry. You got a DNA strand inside of your cell. It's very important. It gives all the instructions. It tells the cell what to do. It tells the cell what to make. It tells the cell how to react. That's fantastic. Except there are some regions of the DNA strand that will not perform their function alone. They need another special region nearby to activate them. So you can sequence the whole DNA strand, and that's really powerful, but you're not quite done, because you need to actually know about three-dimensional proximities of various regions of the DNA strand inside of the cell. Problem, you cannot do that. You cannot just crack open a cell and be like, oh, I got you, there you are. Here's the string, it's all wound up like this, take a snapshot, I'm done. Not even close. What you can do is put a chemical into the cell that destroys most of it and fuses nearby parts together. You then take the fused piece and you look at the two segments and you're like, oh, okay, if I look these up in my sequence DNA table, I know that this is like sequential region 5002, and this one is, 10,208, whatever. You get basically one piece of information for destroying one cell. So you do this again and again and again, and if you do this millions of times, you build up a lot of information about what regions are generally close and what regions are not. You'll notice too, you get some essentially trivial information here, right? These two areas are spatially close because they are linearly close. That's not particularly interesting, but it is true. When you add all these up, you get the contact matrix. So you basically just sequentially number the discrete sections of the DNA strand from end to end. And whenever two regions I and J turned up as close, you add one to their coordinate of the matrix. You do this enough times, the diagonal is blindingly bright because of what we just said. Linear proximity implies spatial proximity. Whatever, it's a graph, it's an adjacency matrix. Who cares? Fine. Square matrix is like the best thing ever, just because a mathematician would come in and say, ooh, that's a graph. It doesn't particularly excite a lot of people, but we'll get there. Here's one little, okay, well, there's many weird things about this data type. One, all of these data points are added up across different cells. You try to get the same cell type, the same cell family, the same culture, whatever, but there's a lot of variance. The DNA strand does not have a canonical form inside of the cell. It changes with time. It changes across different cells in the population. So it's much better to regard this as a statistical object. And even more so, it's a rather frustrating statistical object, because you don't really have, there's a kind of transitivity you would love to have that you do not. So let me briefly discuss a problem here. I talked about these regions. I'm going to give them biological names now. Promoters and enhancers. Promoters promote cellular activity of various kinds, and they're kind of the thing that sometimes just does not activate without help from enhancers, or activates much better if it's given help from enhancers. So there's a certain class of promoters that it is not known if these need to be activated by multiple enhancers simultaneously. So suppose this is a whole contiguous section of enhancers. We want to know, does this promoter ever activate from a single connection, or does it actually need is there some threshold? Does it require 4 simultaneous enhancements to activate? That is an open and, I am told, a very important question. We cannot answer this. Statistically, of course, there's ways to approach this, but in the way you really want to, you cannot answer this with this data type, right? I want to say that WXYZ is a simultaneous connection, and I cannot say that. There is no way out of this kind of fundamental data problem. This whole idea that there's like hidden subtypes in your data, while true, is not something that can ever be experimentally like verified. And until biologists' control over cell populations is so fine that they can literally isolate like the tiniest perturbations causing sub-classifications, we will never even know if we're getting subtypes, or this is not like something that's been proven to happen. We cannot know if this is happening or not. Whatever, I'm driving the point a little too hard. It's quite frustrating. What if we could get information about a bunch of simultaneous connections instead of just a list of pairwise ones? They did that, okay? The biologists figured that out. They did it. So we now have this. We actually have the hypergraph data type, because every single cell now contributes a hyper edge. This arbitrary number of genomic regions were all close and fused together simultaneously. This is great. It doesn't completely solve the variance in your data, because we still have variance over time and variance over cells, but you do know now that a single data point that says WXYZ actually means WXYZ. That's helpful. It's helpful, but bioinformaticians loved the square matrix. The square matrix is like the best possible object. Hypergraphs kind of suck. They're rather frustrating there's no optimal way to store them except in just a list of every edge. You don't want to make like a 20-dimensional matrix that is ridiculously sparse. It's a very frustrating problem. And so analysis of this new kind of data has not really been forthcoming, save for one major entry in the pipeline. We've gone full circle to graph embeddings. This is the major tool available to start people's analysis of, I shouldn't say the major. This one came out very early after this data collection method was developed, and has been rather popular. They call it matcha, and it's a specialized, it's a graph embedding method. You take the hypergraph, you put it in, out comes Euclidean point cloud. Okay, that's the setup. What's the problem? Well, let me tell you a little bit about persistent homology, except I think everyone here is probably quite familiar with persistent homology. So let me tell you a very little bit about persistent homology. Here's a data set, a very artificial, very topologically meaningful data set. Just on the outside chance that someone here has never heard of persistent homology, we basically describe the holes of this data set in 2 dimensions. Whenever you would be able to connect a perimeter without exceeding some certain distance between the points making your perimeter, that starts some feature. And whenever you could fill in a triangle and fill in that entire shape with the final largest triangle, that is the destruction or the death of that feature. We plot these points in 2 dimensions. There's no point that ever goes under the diagonal line, because any feature that is created is destroyed after it's created. So you always have y coordinates bigger than your x coordinates. Here we go, okay? You get a point cloud, you talk about the holes in the point cloud. That's all we need to know. So we got curious in our laboratory, I guess, about what this kind of machine learning method does to topology. So this is, I think, an extremely interesting problem, because topology, persistent homology, emerges entirely from pairwise distances. So if all that I'm doing is I'm putting pairwise distance information, relative information, into a machine learning network, and say, hey, could you balance all this information and turn it into a point cloud? It seems like enough stuff should be preserved that my topology hangs around. My topology, which emerges from all those pairwise relationships, if I do an embedding that's meant to preserve pairwise relationships, it should be pretty okay. We wanted to check on that. Here's my reminding you that there's a biological motivation slide. Sure, topology is important. This problem I brought up before about promoters and enhancers, there's a lot more unlabeled stuff in here that just, it isn't worth getting into. But these loops are fundamentally appearing whenever this kind of structure is here. So topology in the region of these promoter enhancer interactions is very important. Okay, little bit of an artificial problem to artificial example, synthetic example, to set up the question here. Node2vec, which is what I'm going to be testing, goes from graph to point cloud. But I'm just going to cheat a tiny bit for visual clarity and go from point cloud to point cloud. I make this very topologically distinct point cloud. I take its pairwise distance matrix. I take reciprocals so that now close things with small values correspond to high values or edges that are very significant, and call this an adjacency matrix. I can now put this into Node2vec. All right, if anyone wants to worry about it, the reciprocal part is slightly non-trivial. You do introduce a hyperbolic distortion here, but you can mostly account for that. So if I take this point cloud, turn it into a graph, and put the graph into Node2vec, okay, here's what comes out. You have to trust me a little bit here that I was nice and I tried to do this data set. I tried to mess with the parameters quite a lot and get it as pretty as it could. The point being, if you take this silly example and blow it up to like 16 circles, making a circle, 32, whatever, you can eventually make the multiple topological scales of the center circle and the outer circle so different that you lose the information in the embedding dramatically. So if you accept my experimental endeavors, we're losing some information here. Specifically, right, here's persistent homology can pretty much exactly qualify. Well, all right, I mean, I'm going into this with the pitch being persistent homology, but hey, look, using persistent homology, we're going to quantify exactly what was lost, and it's pretty stark. This center circle, which should be about here, it got blown up. It got pushed way, way, way out here because the center radius, essentially, the size of the final triangle that fills in that shape got huge. And all these 8 smaller cycles got reduced down toward the diagonal to the point where they're kind of joining up with the noise, essentially. Okay, well, this is not so great. You just balancing all this stuff. So, all right, I'm not doing Node2vec justice, right? All of these points are in generally excellent position, right? They all have the right neighbors. They're all clustered perfectly, all the purples with the purples, the yellows with the yellows. You can count them if you want. There's not a point out of place here in terms of like the 8 separate pieces of this. It's just that the topology has just more or less been destroyed or distorted during this process. All right, so we're going to fix this in a rather simple way. I don't know, mechanically speaking. That loss function that we iterate on, and whenever we measure how different our proposed embedding is from the graph information that we put into it, we're going to just add another term that determines how far away these 2 objects are. And we're going to try to also reduce that difference. And so while we have this Node2vec loss, which measures, how points relate to each other, we're just going to put in a loss function that is some distance on persistence diagrams. So you can put a lot of functions here. I'm going to be talking about one in particular, but I'm not, you could put anything differentiable here. The reason it's got to be differentiable, you got to use the chain rule. You got to do something kind of kooky, which is, I accept this as a conversational bit of math here. You want to move generators. If any of you have thought about this, you know exactly where it's going. But if you haven't thought about this before, it's a little bit of a weird problem, right? I want to move a topological feature. So I have to be able to move, to be able to differentiate whatever my distance is that says how wrong this persistence diagram is with respect to the generators. And then I have to do the derivative of the generators with respect to the point cloud. This has been done. I don't know if anyone's looked into this, but this is essentially what it amounts to. If you want to push a generator in any of the 4 quadrant directions, you basically just permute through the full list of contract the birth edge of some feature or contract or extend the death edge. So that's it. This is very doable. This is very doable for Viator's RIPS constructions. But if anyone's played around with this, you might know that you can do the differentiation here and pretend that you made everything with the Viator's RIPS construction, but you can actually make them with alpha complexes and it works out. So there's a lot of because computationally, if anyone spent a lot of time trying to do Viator's RIPS persistence diagram computation, and then I tell you that one of my examples in this paper took 40,000 iterations in which I had to make the persistence diagram every single step, you might wonder how I finished within the century. This is all getting into a bit kind of detail, but this is essentially just, you can do this. You can, what was I saying? This part, the derivative of the generators with respect to the point cloud is taken care of. So it's on you to decide your distance and do the derivative of the distance with respect to the generator. Okay, this is where I'm going to take a little bit of, I hope, what turns out to be a kind of educational dip into optimal transport theory, which I know about as much about as I knew about the biology. So here's the distance that we use and that we propose for assorted uses. It doesn't need to be used for my examples. My examples, those 8 circles in one big circle, are you could use anything for those. They're not super complicated examples, but this we kind of propose independently, I guess, or as something that has merit on its own. So, okay, suppose I've got 2 persistence diagrams, the blue ones and the green ones. Here is what I would propose is the optimal matching between these. We use matchings in the field of topological data analysis to kind of talk about the distance between 2 persistence diagrams, right? Anything far away from the diagonal is a more significant feature. And if you need to, you can always match things down to the diagonal where you basically say, you have to throw this feature away and it costs you something. So it's in your best interest to match things far away from the diagonal with candidates in the other persistence diagram to save, because then the sum of all these gray lines basically is the distance between these persistence diagrams. Okay, small rephrasing of the problem, but nothing fundamentally changing. We're going to call these finite counting measures in optimal transport language, okay? So these are now not Euclidean points, they are masses. They are point masses. There's like a mass of size of weight 1 at this exact point and 0 everywhere else. Purely technical, nothing's really changed as far as maybe our intuition for stuff. But now we have to fuss just a little bit because optimal transport is a bit fussy. Backing up for a second, optimal transport theory is generally concerned with exactly what it sounds like. You want to move things and you want to not waste energy moving them. You have a pile of dirt here and you need to move that pile of dirt to many other places. That's not so hard. You take a straight line, you shovel a bunch of dirt and you walk to one of your destinations. Well, now you have 4 piles of dirt of various sizes that need to go to 3 other places, and one of the places is a bit bigger than the 2 nearest piles. What do? It starts to get out of hand rather quickly. And this is the I think one of the earliest entries into the field of optimal transport theory was called the Earth mover's distance, because that's exactly what it was concerned with. So when you're moving dirt, if I'm allowed to lean too much on that analogy, you have the same amount of dirt at the end as you had at the beginning. This sounds a little obvious and a little silly, but in optimal transport, the total mass of your starting and ending distributions being equal is outrageously important. So even in this very simple example, 4 blue points and 3 green points is a little weird. I kind of need to assign masses to all these points such that each distribution adds up to 1. But if I assign each of these blue dots a 1/4 weight and each of the green dots a 1/3, that's a little weird too, because I kind of want the blue and the green to be treated equally. I don't want them to have different sizes just because the total size of my persistence diagrams was different. Add on to that this problem that we love matching things to the diagonal, to the infinite diagonal. What does that mean in optimal transport language? We just have this infinite hill of both blue and green dirt. It doesn't work out, but you can make it work out very easily by cheating. You take all the green points. If you were ever going to match a green point to the diagonal, you're going to match it orthogonally. So you just add those points to the blue distribution. You take the blue points, project them down orthogonally, you add those to the greens. And then what we're really secretly doing is just matching blue blues and green yellows. Okay, all of that. Let's actually get to the meat of it. We use this idea of matchings a lot, and matchings I think are very intuitive to us. You pair off stuff that needs to be paired off to minimize the distance. It's all well and good. Optimal transport, you can phrase this question the exact same way with a slight difference. So C is the cost matrix, and this is between everything that I would want to match up. Every blue and every green, I need to discuss the distance. And you know, this matrix should really be 7 by 7, but I've kind of collapsed the diagonal entries together. And then P dictates the matching that we're proposing. Or let me just skip to this. Here's the matching I showed earlier, and here's how this is reflected in optimal transport language. This is the matching that when you multiply P and C minimizes, or sorry, coordinate-wise multiplication. This is the matrix P that minimizes this optimal transport plan times optimal transport cost problem. This is a whole bunch of technicality to just say this is exactly what we do in optimal transport vocabulary. But you'll notice that these are decimals. And this is because optimal transport is not constrained by mapping objects discretely. It's dirt. You can shovel essentially any amount of dirt you want. So let me propose something a little strange. What if I took this cost matrix, which previously was just the Euclidean distance between every combination of green or blue points, and what if I just absolutely destroyed that information? I made this cost matrix the silliest thing imaginable. I made it all ones. I've destroyed all meaningful information. The optimal matching now between my two distributions, unplugged myself there, that's not good, is the trivial matching. I split every generator up and send exactly 1/7 of it to every other generator in the other persistence diagram with, I've summed up the diagonals again. Why on earth would we do this? Surprise, that's an entropic optimal transport. This is not a joke, not just doing this for fun. This is actually extremely powerful. If you, instead of trying to minimize this product with the original cost matrix of all Euclidean distances, if you take that matrix and you add a very small amount of this very silly cost matrix, you have massively changed the problem. Previously, you can kind of think that minimizing this with the original cost matrix is the strictest problem imaginable. It has exactly one precise, perfect, frustrating to find solution. But adding this little bit of wiggle room massively helps things. And I'm about to just not keep telling you, oh, it's so good, and I'll show you why. So for starters, even if in this optimal, what do I call it? This entropic setting, these 2 points still get matched, like my original proposed matching, there's a tiny bit of this green point going all over to these other places. And so generally what you get from this setting is you still get like a kind of canonical matching. Like this blue and this green pretty much will always, they're like 99% paired up. So you can extract a discrete matching from this if you really want to. But if you're just trying to move generators, you can just take the weighted sum of all these vectors and immediately get where you're supposed to be pushing this. You can get the derivative of the distance with respect to the generators. This gets very complicated. It has a lot of strange problems that I don't understand, a lot of very weird optimal transport theory. Theo Lacombe was extremely instrumental in helping us with all this and doing all this, I should say. And so here's his final pitch for why this distance is very powerful. And my pitch, because I am his co-author and I support him, and he explained this to me, and I do believe I actually understood enough of it to propose it to you. The main one is that this is super fast. Generally, super fast is not so much a problem in our setting because getting the persistence diagrams is the really hard part. Once you have them, the odds that you have persistence diagrams so big that they're going to be computationally difficult to match, maybe not so likely. But that's in here. Theoretically, makes optimal transport people very happy. When we say Wasserstein distance in the TDA sense, I think they get conniptions. And very statistically robust. Okay, there's a little foray. You put it together, punchline, we fixed it, I guess. You start with this. This was the bad version. And when you add in this new loss function, you reintroduce the topological features. And here it is without all my drawings over top of it. So by combining these, we were able to get pretty good results. I now have like just a handful of heuristic comments that might be interesting to anyone with a lot like some machine learning experience. Our topological loss function has no sense whatsoever of relationships between points. If I were to draw connections to the topological autoencoders paper, which I believe many of you might be familiar with, that is handling both. That's handling the topology and the actual relationships between points. This data set that I put in used to be a perfectly smooth color gradient circle, and I told my machine learning network, embed this only looking at topology. So it made a circle, and it, you'll notice, perfectly removed accidental topology from all the outlying points. The persistence diagram of this is exactly one point of exactly the right coordinates, but it's completely botched everything else. So this needs a partner, which is why I started with the whole Node2vec discussion. It's very single-minded when it comes to creating topology. Here maybe is the last heuristic thing. I'm 40 minutes, is that correct? For the full duration? Okay. I do have a stopwatch right over my shoulder. Well, your shoulders. So we'll end on this. Something really cool. I think it's cool. There's this idea in machine learning called mini batching, where you don't use all your data every single step. You just use stochastically subsample to some very small amount of your data set, and you do all the comparisons there, and you only update the points in the subsample. Here is this same problem I've been showing throughout the talk. You put it in to the new Topological Node2vec machine learning network, and it looks like garbage. And maybe some of you are realizing what happened. You start off, and this thing's like, oh, hold on. The death time of that very big cycle is too large. I need to shrink it. So it finds the 3 points, which make the killing triangle, and it pulls them in together. Next iteration, guess which 3 points form the killing triangle? It's these. So it pulls them even closer together. And it does this 5,000 times or whatever, and you're left with complete garbage. It turns out that the data, the performance of something like this not only kind of improved, but like in the case of using an aggressive topological loss function requires you to heavily mini batch your data set so that you don't have this runaway topological obsession here. Thought that was very cool. I have just some animations. Here's an embedding with no mini batching at all, and you can see that it very quickly locks in a ridiculous shape and just stays there forever. And then here, it's just replaying. The next one is 25% mini batching. It looks like absolute chaos because it's only updating 25% of the data set. It's computing the persistence diagrams from only that 25%. And then just like that, it just like magically converges. This was frustrating at the time because I could not figure out what on earth was happening, but realizing what the topology was doing and why it was distorting stuff was very fun. More problems if your persistence diagrams won't match at all because the target and the destination just keep matching to the diagonal. That's a little weird. You can do some very, very heuristic stuff and just shove the persistence diagrams up into the void until they're forced to match with each other. And then here's the final example. We did a hollow torus with 600 something points. The black circles in the middle are essentially, I'm trying to show the degree 2 homology, right? It starts off perfectly hollow. The original unaltered Node2vec squishes it almost completely flat. And then we're able to sort of reinflate the donut. And that is that. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much. So before we get to questions, I would ask everyone to unmute themselves and give a round of applause for our speaker today. And now, questions. Teresa?
I would have one.
Hello.
So thank you for the very nice talk. I'm interested in this. It seems to me like it's kind of a modified version of the Wasserstein distance that we usually use for persistence diagrams. What would happen, or would it even be possible to use the usual, I think, one Wasserstein distance instead of what you did? Or where would the problems be? Would it not be differentiable, or?
So if you can extract the matching itself, which you should be able to, so like a lot of packages, they need to actually have a matching to give you a distance, right? Maybe they don't often give you the matching itself because not a lot of people care. But if the matching is ever computed and you can, I don't know, ask the person who wrote it or try to mess with it yourself to spit the matching back out, you have everything you need because you can just, you know, you have your target persistence diagram, which comes from the input data. In our case, the graph or the Euclidean data set we use to like fake the graph. And then you have whatever generator in the current embedding, wherever it's matched, you just push it along that vector. So it's, I guess, theoretically speaking, it's rather uncomfortable because I've never really thought about how you phrase that. Like, it is the derivative of the Wasserstein distance with respect to the generators if the Wasserstein distance we usually use were differentiable, and I think it's often not, but you can use it. And in my early examples I was, and it worked out.
Okay, nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
More questions for Killian?
I wanted to ask, just in your visuals at the end, what were the big discs? I think I missed it. Keep going further.
Here.
Yeah, the big discs in the bottom left.
So to try to demonstrate in 2 dimensions that these are hollow tori, I wrote code to inflate the largest possible spheres inside the center. I basically took the mathematically averaged center line of the torus and tried to fill out the largest sphere possible.
Cool.
If someone has like a more, rigorous way of visualizing this sort of thing, I'm open to it. But I did check these rather rigorously, like in 3D. I pulled them around to make sure. For example, down here, like, fine, what if that center line is just not the best spot to be inflating the spheres? And it wasn't, so I've actually adjusted it. The line can now wobble up and down with the data set, whatever. I'll ask you to trust me that this is a quite accurate representation of how inflated these are or not.
I like it, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Sometimes you have an image in your head you want to make, and you're like, I have no idea how I would do this, but gosh darn if I'm not going to try.
Okay, so in this case, we will have the rest of the questions offline, and now I'm gonna end the recording. And thanks again, Killian, for your wonderful talk.
Thank you so much.